Well, hey everybody. This is round two for me recording. The first one that I recorded, I failed to turn the microphone on. So I thought about posting the video and just telling y'all to get really good at reading my lips, but then realized that that was not going to work. And so here we are to record again. The bonus is that I'm mildly frustrated with myself, and so we'll likely move quickly and cut this short. The downside was, man, I think I really did a much better job on the first video. So whatever you think of this one, the first one was better. There we go. We'll just go with that out of the front end. This is week 32 of our walk through the Gospel of Matthew. I don't know if it's a walk at this point. I think maybe a crawl is a better description. But we were up to chapter 16, and we were looking at just the first 12 verses tonight. I will preface that by saying that really, if I were to have done this right, I should be looking at all of chapter 16. But what comes in the second half of the chapter with Peter's confession is such an important moment in the gospel and for what Matthew is doing for his earliest audience that I really felt it important to take more time with that one. And I did not have any desire, nor do you have any desire, for this to be a 50-minute video. So we will just look at the first 12 verses this evening. And so what I'm going to do is start by just reading the first, we'll go with first 4 verses, and I'll talk a little bit about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and then I'll look at the second half of the passage, and we'll talk about the disciples and what Matthew wants us to notice here in similarity and in difference between those groups of individuals. So first off, Matthew chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. One day, the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test Jesus, demanding that he show them a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. Jesus replied, "You know the saying, red sky at night means fair weather tomorrow, and red sky in the morning means foul weather all day. You know how to interpret the weather signs in the sky, but you don't know how to interpret the signs of the times. Only an evil, adulterous generation would demand a miraculous sign. But the only sign I will give them is the sign of the prophet Jonah." Then Jesus left and went away. So a couple things of note here. And it's actually everything that's on the board has to do with these first 4 verses, because it really is a tone setter and a marker for us and for Matthew's first audience. First and foremost, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are not friendly. They don't agree on much of anything. They don't like each other all that much. Their places of power and influence exist in separate areas. The Sadducees, for all intents and purposes, have control of the temple. The Pharisees, while they continue to do temple worship, believe that the temple system is at least in some form corrupt because of those guys. They disagree on which passages of what we now call the Old Testament are sacred. The Sadducees hold that the first 5 books are the only ones that are authoritative. The Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that everything else may be informative but is not sacred. The Pharisees disagree. They believe that the first 5 are sacred, that the history and that the wisdom lit is sacred, that the prophets are certainly probably of the utmost importance for them, because it is the warning from the prophets that to fail to follow the law results in destruction that becomes kind of their guiding light. It's the reason they're so concerned with law keeping in the first few centuries, is because to keep the law properly is what prevents us from being destroyed by the Assyrians, part 2 or 3 or whatever at this point. So, because they have all of these different emphasis and focuses, and they do not go together. So, the fact that they are mentioned as being here together at all, I don't know how historic it is, but it's definitely symbolic. And if they are physically together, teaming up, then that definitely puts early readers on notice, because it would be the only thing ever that they worked together on. That's not entirely true. They're mentioned together one other place in the entire Bible, also Matthew, and it's early on when they are together talking with John the Baptist, at which point he calls them a brood of vipers, and then he dies. And I think that what we get here is a callback to that moment, because they get together, they plot against John, eventually John dies, and now they're together, now they're against Jesus. And of course, as people who know the rest of the story, we know the direction this is headed. That's true for Matthew's audience as well, but there is this sense of foreboding where you know the direction that this is going. But Matthew does it to set apart the Jewish Christian church to which he writes. The vast majority of his church to which he writes is Jewish, from traditional Judaism represented by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Whatever range of that spectrum they exist on, they are the whole of it. Certainly the two most important voices in the first century, and in spite of their disagreements, very representative of everyone, whether that's the temple system or the synagogue system. They represent that. And so Matthew, whose earliest readers are Jewish, are feeling rejected by the temple, are wondering whether or not it's worth, are feeling rejected not by the temple but by the synagogues, are wondering whether or not it's worth continuing to follow Jesus, whether or not Jesus was truly the Son of God, whether or not it's worth putting up with the rejection they're experiencing from places where they've always belonged, in their community, in their synagogue, in their family. And so Matthew tells the story about maybe the ultimate representatives of those places and what Jesus had to say about their ability to understand what God is doing. They come asking for a sign from a person who has been working miracle after miracle, feeding after feeding, healing after healing, in a place where maybe the Sadducees didn't spend much time, but the Pharisees certainly did. There have been Pharisees present for many of Jesus' teachings and works. There have been conflicts and arguments before. This is not round one for them. And yet, in spite of seeing and hearing those things before, here they are demanding again. And so Jesus basically says, you're much better meteorologists than you are theologians, because you can figure out if it's going to rain or not based on sunrise and sunset, but you have the Son of God standing in front of you, and you cannot manage to work that one out. And that then is a challenge for the early church. What are they going to pay attention to? What are they going to focus on? What are they going to care about? And is what they are going to focus on, care about, where they're going to place their emphasis, is that going to be on something that is of the utmost importance, like Jesus, or on something that doesn't matter, like predicting the weather? And weather prediction is a little bit offhanded. What it really is representing there is the worries of today. The reason you need to know the forecast is so you need to when to plant, when to harvest, when not to plant, when not to harvest, whether you need to move livestock around. Should you put the sheep here or there? Can you go here or do work there? Like, that's one of those worries of today things, shorthanded into the weather. Then we get to the disciples. Because if we've got the Pharisees and Sadducees, representative of traditional Judaism, not getting it, then we have the disciples, the consummate insiders, who then seem to be in kind of the same boat. Verse 5, later, after they crossed over to the other side of the lake, the disciples discovered they had forgotten to bring any bread. Watch out, Jesus warned them, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And at this, they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. Jesus knew what they were saying, so he said, you have so little faith. Why are you arguing with each other about having no bread? Don't you understand yet? Don't you remember the 5,000 I fed with 5 loaves, and the baskets left over you picked up? Or the 4,000 I fed with 7 loaves, and the large baskets of leftovers you picked up? Why can't you understand that I'm not talking about bread? So I say again, Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Jesus busted out his teacher voice. At last they understood he wasn't speaking about yeast and bread, but about the deceptive teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So after this colossal moment of misunderstanding, the Pharisees and Sadducees, who cannot seem to understand the Son of God in front of them, and this promise from Jesus that they're going to get the sign of Jonah, which of course points to 3 days in the belly of whale, earth, and then being spit up on shore, resurrected to life. That's the image, the sign of Jonah that we get there. Then Jesus has this conversation with his disciples, who cannot seem to get their minds off their stomachs. So if the Pharisees and Sadducees are too concerned about the weather to see Jesus in front of them, now we have the disciples too concerned about their stomachs to see Jesus in front of them. And it should be humorous to us that their concern is bread, because of the two examples Jesus uses as he corrects their misunderstanding. Because we've just looked at these two stories recently in Matthew's gospel where Jesus feeds thousands of people with what amounts to crumbs for thousands of people. And yet here are his disciples in the boat, still worried about today. This, in some ways, calls us back to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus teaching on worry, Jesus modeling prayer for his disciples, these moments where he's reminding his disciples to pay attention to what matters and to what doesn't, to not allow their worry or their concern about this or that, what they will wear today, what they will eat today, how many hairs are on their head, to not allow those types of things to distract them from the God that is in front of them, to distract them from doing what they are supposed to do and living the way they are supposed to live. And yet, in spite of those teachings, in spite of those cautions, here the disciples are missing the God that is in front of them because they're worried about food. And they think, because all they can think about is food, that Jesus is chastising them for not remembering to bring bread. Where Jesus then has to correct them and let them know that this has nothing to do with bread at all, but everything to do with placing their confidence, their focus in the wrong place. So what that means for the early church is to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Less so the Sadducees by the time Matthew writes, because their power was really associated with the temple, and the temple has been destroyed. There's still some influence in those few decades after the destruction of the temple, but it really disappears pretty quickly. Instead, it is a caution against caring so much about the tradition and the system and the comfort and familiarity in which you have there, that you make the same mistake they did and ignore that in Jesus, God is doing something new, big, powerful. I don't know if new is the right word, but it is the ultimate fulfillment of everything that God has done and is doing and will do. And just as the Pharisees and Sadducees missed it because they were worried about the wrong stuff, just as the disciples nearly missed it because they were worried about the wrong stuff, so too can we miss it if we are worried about the wrong stuff. Now, it is because of, I think, this moment and this redirection and this moment of understanding, which I just want to pause and say how much fun it is to watch the disciples get frustrated with Jesus because he teaches in parables and they don't understand and has to have them explained, that then when Jesus gives them something so plain that you shouldn't possibly miss it, the first thing they do is try and figure out how Jesus is using yeast as a parable. Jesus has to go, no, we're talking straight this time. You got it. It's really as simple as it sounds. Beware of Anyway, it's after this moment of clarity, after this point of understanding, that we have the first time when one of the disciples, and of course it's Peter, gets it, truly gets it, and says, you're the Son of God. And that's what we're going to talk about next week how understanding and realization, placing our attention and focus in the right place leads to the type of understanding and realization that moves us closer to God. So there's your teaser for next week. For this week, we are done. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back at it next week.